our emotions come to the surface when we're emotionally connected to a character's journey in a fictional story. But there's also the opportunity to step into another character's shoes and actually experience life through their lens. Reading fiction enhances our social cognition, our ability to simulate situations that maybe we haven't gone through in real life, but when we're reading through the lens of a fictional character, we're actually living the book.
This is Christina Mandlakiani, co-founder of Mind Valley and host of Mind Valley Book Club. My guest is Emely Rumble. Welcome, Emily, to Mind Valley Book Club studio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Emely Rumble is the licensed clinical social worker, bibliotherapist, and the author of the book Bibliotherapy in the Bronx. So a writer and an author. And as far as I know from your book, at least, your degree, the first degree that you got was actually in English literature, which is always a great combination. I really love books by people who both know the science and the language. So the book that we're discussing today is Bibliotherapy in the Bronx. Traditionally, I can only probably produce a cover on my iPad, but if Emily has, and my iPad is attached to my charger, but if Emily has the book, yes. Yes, great. You're welcome to show the book baby to our audience anytime you feel like it. In addition to that, I want to say that Emily has done this work for 15 years with many clients, and also she is an expert whose work has been published in quite a lot of media, such as the Health Magazine, New York Times, and other such impressive media. So if I've left something out, which is important to mention, please, Emily, say it now.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. You didn't leave anything out. I will say I miss the Bronx every day. We recently relocated to my husband's hometown in Massachusetts. So we've been here for a little over 9 months now, and I'm slowly adjusting, and I miss home every day. So we are calling in from Springfield, Massachusetts today.
Wow, that's quite a transition. I think I did the reverse transition from a quiet place to a huge multi-million city. I want to start our conversation with a question which is not strictly speaking book related. But, being a host of book club, I very often hear people saying that, reading is dying, nobody's reading. And there's statistics, of course, that shows that we read less. And what we read is not the same as it used to be, that we read short form, we do screen reading more than the traditional old-fashioned reading. So I hear these horror stories all the time. And you're the best person for me to ask. What do you have to say about that? Do you really think this is happening, or is that just something which maybe will pass?
Absolutely. I mean, I can only speak from here in America, but the statistics speak for themselves. The literacy rates in our country are severely low. And we also see that in schools, a lot of the enrichment programs that used to support early readers, I remember growing up and you know, we'd have a list of a reading goal, read 10 books, collect your points, and we might have a pizza party on Friday, right? Like there were all these built in supports for children to encourage us to read, to get us excited to read. I was in first grade when my teacher took us to the library to get library cards, and it was embedded in the culture. And I think it really starts from a young age because school has kind of sucked the joy out of reading, to be quite honest with you. I think everything has been heavily based upon academic metrics that make reading something academic and studious as opposed to what it should be, particularly in early childhood. Reading should be something fun. It should be something that fosters creativity and imagination. It should be something that children are not only doing at school regularly and praised and validated for doing, but also at home, right? And so I think our society has also changed a lot. We're living in an attention economy. Everything is instant gratification, social media, the internet moves very quickly. We're also in the age of AI. So that has taken away from folks' ability to not only engage with reading as a practice that is self-reflective and nurturing, but also we just don't have the attention spans, I think. And this is not just children and youth. I'm talking on a grand scale, right? Adults as well. The culture doesn't really support a reading practice of care. But for those of us that our readers who've always turned to books for self-reflection and enjoyment, that's a pastime that will live on with us for the rest of our lives. And so my hope is that the more that those of us who are keen to keep reading share and engage in the art of gathering, whether that be through a virtual book club, an in-person book club, um, a course at your local library, right? That we begin to gather and continue to discuss books and recommend books and engage with texts in a way that fosters community. And I do see that happening on a grand scale. I'm also a bibliotherapist, so I attract clients who are readers. But I think there's so many different levels and layers to the issue that you're describing. I think it is cultural, I think it's societal, and I think the attention economy has really made things worse.
You mentioned that school zaps out the joy out of reading, and from a very early age we read because we need to fulfill certain academic requirements, and I think it carries on to our adult life, because most of the people that and I interview a lot of people on the street as well about their reading habits. They say they read to learn something new, or they read work related, so that relationship between reading for learning, I think it stays throughout the whole life. And with that relationship, obviously AI is very disruptive, because it's much easier to get a summary from AI rather than go through 200 pages of a book. So I know that you support both fiction and nonfiction reading. Talk about the differences, and is pleasure reading, like, what's the value of pleasure reading if everybody reads just to learn something?
Yeah, I love that question because I think it really depends on the person. I try to tell people that before I began specializing in bibliotherapy, which is the selection of literature to foster emotional healing, I'm a therapist, right? So my training is as a mental health professional. So before I even engage a client in therapy, I'm going to determine whether or not bibliotherapy is an effective method to use with that client. And to your point, there are some clients who come to me and they do want to read, but they prefer nonfiction. And that's a part of the intake that I do with every client. Not only do I want to know that bibliotherapy is a method you'd be open to trying, but I also do an intake where I get a sense of each client's reading preferences. And so what I found in my practice is that for some people, reading nonfiction or reading to learn is pleasurable, right? Like that is an escape. My brain doesn't work that way, but for some people, it reduces anxiety to obtain information. It reduces anxiety to understand things within a historical context. So there's so many people who are actually reading nonfiction because that's what they find pleasurable, and that's what they find their enjoyment in, right? I think overall, when we talk about the difference between reading fiction and reading nonfiction, is that there is a way that fiction provides us with a literary escape, right? Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who is known as the godmother of children's multicultural literature, described books as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And she was referring specifically to reading fiction, because there's a way that when we read fiction, we're able to not only look in the mirror and have to see ourselves more clearly. How do I feel about that? What are my values, right? Our emotions come to the surface when we're emotionally connected to a character's journey in a fictional story. But there's also the opportunity to step into another character's shoes and actually experience life through their lens. There's also an opportunity to have like a sneak peek and sort of be a voyeur into what someone else's intersectional identity and experience is in the world. And so we're really talking about the way that reading fiction enhances our social cognition, our ability to simulate situations that maybe we haven't gone through in real life, but when we're reading through the lens of a fictional character, we're actually living the book. And we're gaining new insights. We're gaining more empathy and more compassion, not just for people who are walking a different walk than we are in life, but also for ourselves. So I think that there's a way that reading fiction and engaging with stories that are much different than our own challenges us to consider things from another worldview and also validates us. I know we've all had that feeling where we've read something and we're like, oh, this author just put the words so perfectly to what I wish I could have described. But you read it, and not only does it validate what you know to be true in your body and in your lived experience, but it just feels so good that somebody out there crafted the perfect sentence, the perfect description, right? To really name a thing. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what therapy helps us to do is it grants us the language to be able to name things. And so whether we're engaging with fictional stories or non-fictional stories, our mind is wired as story thinking. And so when we engage with stories where we're emotionally connected, so much has the ability to rise into our conscious awareness.
So I want to read out a quote about that from your book. Books provide us with a language we struggle to access when we are in survival mode, making our suffering a thing of beauty and nuance. I think it's such a beautiful quote. I deliberately am going to leave the nonfiction aside because that's what we talk about so much, and it is explicit in a way that it's obviously is going to teach you a point and convey a message. If you want to read, I know that a lot of your work is dealing with racism, at least in the U.S. context.
Yeah.
Sorry. Of course, you can read a book about that. I was reading a chapter on psychology about that just yesterday. But it's a different thing to live an experience with a character in your story, I believe. So we'll focus on the pleasure reading. Uh, what I wanted to ask before we move on to that. As I was reading the book, it was quite clear that you do talk to therapists and to people who work with other people. Although, as a mother, I could also learn things from there because you talk about bibliotherapy for young kids quite a bit. And also, as a person who just loves books, or maybe a person who had troubles reading books when I was a child. But who was your primary audience for whom you wrote the book? And did you have anything else in mind, or were you talking specifically to this kind of people? That yes,
Yeah,
that's the
I,
question.
I love that question, Christina, because that was a big decision that I had to make. And I think every author has to decide when you're writing who is your audience. And I knew that I wanted this book to contribute to the literature on creative arts therapy. So bibliotherapy is just one method. There's dance therapy, there's art therapy, right? There's many different creative expressive modalities that therapists can use. I wanted a therapist who was interested in bibliotherapy to pick up my book and feel empowered to try to engage more with clients who are literature lovers. But I knew that that wasn't going to be my target audience. I really wanted the book to cater to people who read as an act of self-care, as an act of self, by validation and finding community. I think what I have found after creating Literacy NYC and attracting so many clients who are readers is that we possess unique strengths as readers that actually do benefit our mental health, that actually do lend themselves to finding our kind of people, whether that be at a book talk, at a book club, whether that be at a book event, right? Or just in a book, right? Some clients tell me my best friend is a fictional character, and I love that because we internalize these representations when we're reading and we feel emotionally connected. So I wanted readers to know, and I think also I'll say this for those of us who grew up who'd rather be reading than socializing or who were, bookworms. We were told from a young age, get your head out of the book and go outside and touch grass and, live your life outside of the book. And so I really wanted to write a book that was going to validate that reader, that person who has always found solace and safety in the covers of a good book. I wanted to validate that when you're reading, you are healing. When you're reading, you are living. You are processing your emotions. Some of us read because it helps us to survive a difficult life, or it helps us to process difficult emotions because we don't have a safe space or somebody to talk to who will really listen to us to help us navigate difficult things we go through in life. So many of us turn to books for different reasons, and I wanted to write a love letter to readers who read for mental.
And this is a very needed love letter because I think reading is the I don't want to say a dying breed, but it's just not a topic that people I don't know, people engage as much with nowadays, which is a little sad, actually, massively sad. I'm now on a rumble about about it. But I want to say to people who haven't read the book, so it is a very practical book. It has quite a lot of science, in fact, about how reading is good for you. It has practical pointers. It has case studies, which is particularly good if you like a good story, because ultimately it is about living several lives through the books, and yeah, and it has reflection points which are engaging. I think for a reader, you said you were writing it for a reader, but I think it's exactly about your experience, your relationship with books, and in addition to that, it has a lot of suggestions for reading, with a lot of book reviews. I think your book your book could be totally taken into pieces for quotes on Goodreads and Amazon Books, because it has some very very good reviews of books that you have read. I want to ask a question which I don't even know how to ask very well, because well, I'm obviously talking from the place of privilege, but I know that you have had a very hard story, and you focus quite a lot on people who are maybe vulnerable and marginalized. You talk about sexism a lot. You touch upon LGBTQ communities and everything. So. Like everything in this world, a lot has been created by the white man. Like psychology, I know is full of that. So, what is the most hard in? As I said, it's a little hard for me to ask this question, but what do you think is the biggest challenge for the non-white male well, if we're talking about whether it's psychologist, therapy, social work, or even literature or poetry?
Yeah, thank you for asking such a brave question. I really appreciate it. And I think it's a really big question that you and I can talk for hours about, particularly when it comes to publishing, like big publishing and traditional publishing. Um, there's a lot that I want to say about that, but I think to the heart of your question, which is what would I say to somebody who is not a white man navigating an intersectional identity where maybe perhaps they're queer or a woman or um, BIPOC of a marginalized identity or community, is that it starts with you knowing that your story matters, right? It starts with you not allowing your story or your history to be erased. I think particularly right now in America, especially with the current politics in our country, we're seeing not just an increase in the banning of books, but we're seeing the rolling back of, for example, SNAP benefits, a lot of programs that benefited the most marginalized populations, children and families. Um, and there's a lot of fear mongering happening. There's a lot of lies being told, right? And so I think the first thing is we cannot allow our stories to be erased. We have to share our stories and speak our truths and not allow anyone to convince us that we are without history. And this is why so much of my work as a Puerto Rican and African American bibliotherapist is about helping my clients to honor their ancestry, right? So in bibliotherapy in the Bronx, I focus a lot on librarianship because here in America, even after integration, we didn't have access to literature. We would be killed, right, if we were found to learn how to read, our ancestors, during slavery times. And so these are very real aspects of our history that have ripple down effects to the barriers that we face today, to those of us that are living in communities that are impoverished, or where I come from in the Bronx, right? We didn't have a lot of clean parks for me to take my children to when they were really little. I'd have to take them to different neighborhoods or to the botanical gardens, right? Like all of the experiences that we have that make us feel how deeply we are oppressed, whether that be right outside your window and the violence that happens in your community, or the trash on the street, or somebody else stereotyping you because of the color of your skin, right? Like the only defense against that is knowing your history, knowing the beauty. that you come from, the strength of your legacy. I write a lot about my grandmother in my book because she is the one who raised me. I'm the daughter of two teen parents, and I grew up with a really strong Puerto Rican identity because of who my grandmother was and who she taught me to be. But I didn't know a lot about my father's side of the family until I went to college. I studied literature and I specialized in Black American literature. I started reading Toni Morrison. I started studying Maya Angelou, June Jordan, Audre Lorde. And as a young woman reading these works, I was blown away by the strength and fortitude of Black women writers, right? And so I know that's a long-winded answer, but that's really where it starts, is honoring who you are, not internalizing any lie about you because of the color of your skin or any aspect of your identity, really finding cultural pride and your legacy, your ancestry, and letting that be your starting point. All of the stereotype and the stigma and the hatred in this world, the only defense against that is to know who you are and to like who you are and to become somebody who is compassionate and studious and wants to move through life with curiosity, not just about your own experiences, but about that of others as well. And that's another thing I love about reading because it just humanizes all of us, right? Like, I read a statistic the other day that said most cases of suicide are actually white men. And it blew me
Mm.
away because I have very few white men that I provide therapy to, but I do have two. And these men are severely depressed, right? And so they're also impacted by racism and patriarchy and all of these oppressive
Yeah.
systems, because you can't be who you are if the world says, well, if you're white and you're male, then you should have reached this pinnacle of success. You should be better off. You should be better looking. You should have a partner that's right of a certain caliber. So we're all up against something. Some of us more than others. So let's be honest about that. But I do think it starts with honoring our lineages and understanding our history, because there's so much abundance and strength when we reach back to understand where we come from. It's not just trauma. It's not just pain.
So I want to, and I think we're venturing in a little bit philosophical area and a little dangerous, again for me. But part of understanding your history is actually hearing the stories. Well, that's how humanity has kept the story, like the consistent story of who we are. It's how I know that I am myself is because I have the connected memories all the way back to my past.
Mhm.
Now, and here I'm going to say something maybe risque. I'm sorry, and forgive me in advance. But when I'm looking at the popular media, at least, because books are a little more diverse than, for example, what we see on TV. While a lot of effort has been put into diversifying the cast, the stories essentially that we are talking are still white people's stories. They're just maybe like diversified in many ways. There are not a lot of stories which are original stories of people coming from different parts of the world, different walks of life, different circumstances. And I was born in Soviet Union, so I'm very like maybe more attuned to the fact that not everything is white American in
Right,
this world. I picked up
right.
a book here about African history, and there are author there said I wanted that history be told by people in Africa rather than the again white researchers telling us our story. So, what's your observation? And I know your book has so many recommendations, but are we moving anywhere closer to actually hearing the authentic, original stories of people who have been misrepresented or underrepresented for centuries?
I think that there are BIPOC authors who are telling those stories. I don't think that they're being supported by big publishing. I don't think that they're the ones that are getting the book contracts and access to the archives. And also, I feel like there's a big issue in publishing with marketing the work of authors of color, especially here in America. So I saw a post the other day. One of my friends is a literary activist, and she's always calling publishers out. And she recently reposted a post that this major publisher had made about books coming out summer 2026. And she called them out and she said, I'm confused. There's not one indigenous or black or BIPOC author on this entire list. I'm confused. And out of curiosity, I started doing my own research because I know that publisher has sent me books before by BIPOC authors. So I wanted to, in fact check that there wasn't any BIPOC authors in their summer releases, and I saw that there actually were a few, not many, only three, which is another issue in and of itself. But still, they weren't pushing those titles on social media. So it looked as though their summer releases were all written by white authors. And so we're not seeing the books that are being written by BIPOC authors. They're not being effectively marketed. They're also not being sent to their intended reader. Like, I know there's a lot of book influencers who receive books by authors that they don't support or that they don't read, when there's other readers of that same history, right, who would love a chance to read an advanced reader's copy or to be an early reviewer for a book, particularly if that book is telling their cultural history or their cultural and ethnic background. And so I think there's a multi-tiered issue here with why we're not getting the history directly from the sources, or why it's not being supported once it's released. And we know that the first week of sales and publishing is everything. If a book doesn't perform well that first week, it's very unlikely that that book will continue to be reprinted. And so I think there's a lot of this has to do with the politics of publishing. And I'm speaking this humbly because I was published through Row House Publishing, which is known as a small indie press that is a disruptor, that intentionally publishes BIPOC authors, especially Black women authors. I love my publisher. They supported me as much as they could. I also have a large audience on social media, and I have a book club. But again, your number of followers, right, doesn't translate into book sales. So, as someone who marketed my own book and did as much as I could with a therapy practice and two small children, I still didn't reach my goal. And I'm not a year out yet. I'll make a year, April 29th, of Bibliotherapy in the Bronx being out. But I know the tremendous effort that myself and my community included has made for my book to be successful. And I didn't meet that benchmark for quarter one and quarter two of my book release. So I really do think that there are real barriers that exist in publishing that make this issue much, much difficult to navigate.
Well, I've noticed recently that apparently, at least in science, most of Nobel Prizes were given for works published like 10, 20 years prior to when they received the Nobel Prize for that. And I think that there are quite a lot of authors who became famous years after they published their most famous works. So hopefully it's more the mark of time than, anything else. So I'm going to slightly move now to a little bit lighter topic, and I'm sorry that I stayed here, but maybe it's because I was reading
Please.
on.
No, don't
I just
apologize.
felt.
This is so important. These are the conversations we should be having with each other, And I appreciate that you shared that, you were born in the Soviet Union, because I studied in England for a year. I studied at the University of York. And had I not had that experience, I don't think I would have thought on a global scale. Studying abroad for a year opened my lens so much to the international landscape, like the global world at large. I think here in America, we're so egocentric and we feel like this is like reality. And it's like, no, there's a whole world out there, which is another reason why we need to read more in America.
I think this is amazing, and then books actually take us to more than just different countries. They sometimes take us to different eras and different, I don't know,
Yes.
universes.
Yes.
So you mentioned also activism, and I wanted to stick to this word. At the end of your book, you talk about pleasure activism. I know this word came from a slightly different context, but you call yourself also a pleasure activist. Could you maybe go a little bit into that idea?
Yeah, so the idea of pleasure activism was founded by Adrienne Marie Brown, who is one of my favorite Black feminist scholars and thinkers. And her whole notion of pleasure activism is that activism isn't just about, fighting a good fight. That sometimes activism is about seeking our own pleasure. What brings us joy, right? And we're not just talking about sensual or sexual pleasure, but it could be that too, of course. It's about the way that we shift our perspective. So many of us grew up with boxing gloves on, and we learned that we needed to be very tough early on. And, whenever we have to put up a fight, we're ready to fight. But sometimes activism is in taking the gloves off and then being like, you know what, I'm tired. I don't want to fight today. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to take a nap. This is also very much in line with Bishop Trisha Hersey from the Nap Ministry. She talks about rest as resistance, right? So it's this idea that sometimes the best defense that we have is rest, play, joy, presence. And that's why I included it in bibliotherapy in the Bronx, because I think for so many of us who are drawn to books as a self care practice, books are very regulating for our nervous system. We love cozying up with a good story after a long day, right? If you're a parent or a caregiver for an aging parent or family member, you know how draining it can be to be responsible for somebody else's care, right? But when you're reading a book, you get to just be with yourself. You get to enter a new landscape. You get to engage in adventure and play. And so that's the whole principle behind pleasure activism.
And I really love this idea because I also want to promote more reading for pleasure. We talked about that in the beginning, and for some people, learning is pleasure. But again, the question probably is what kind of learning. I'm a huge fan of neuropsychology nowadays. I have no idea, and I'm actually truly enjoying it. So I agree with that. Yet a lot of the times we kind of think that this is a waste of time. I should read for efficiency, let's say. So I'm a huge proponent of reading for pleasure. I want to ask you because you go into science of why reading is good for you in your book. So, what is so good about reading, let's say, a good novel?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't want to give the book away because I do have a segment in the book about defense mechanisms and about the way that our psyche is structured to protect us. There are things that are hard to face. There are emotional truths that are difficult to process. A lot of the way that the psyche is structured is to convince us that we're okay even when we're in pain. So sometimes we project onto other people, I don't feel that way, right? She's this thing, I'm not, right? Or we deny how we feel and we say, well, I'm fine. No, you're not. No, you're not. You're struggling right now, right? But we can't accept that because we still got to go to work, pay the bills, take care of the kids, right? Do all of the things. And so when I talk about the neuroscience of reading, I'm talking about the way that engaging with literature allows our defenses to come down. When we're talking about things through the lens of a fictional story, we're still talking about some important things, right? We're talking about conflict. Every fictional story has a conflict, whether that be a conflict the protagonist is dealing with themselves, something that's a belief, self-sabotaging behavior, right? That could be something the protagonist is dealing with between them and another character, so an interpersonal conflict, or a conflict that they have with the world at large, right? Societal oppression, like we kind of talked about earlier. And so I think when we're reading, even though it's not us going through the book, we're actually engaging in a cognitive process that is putting us through a simulation where now I have to face my rage, my envy, all of the shadow aspects of myself that in my day to day life, I would be like, oh no, I don't feel that way. I would never, right? Hurt a fly but we're human. We all have an instinct, right? It's kill or be killed, right? And I always tell clients this in therapy because, for example, I was working with a client who was like, she was frustrated with her husband. She said, I want to choke him out. I said, good, tell me, how would you do it? Would you do it like this, like this? And she looked at me like I was crazy. She was like, Emily, you want me to tell you how I would choke my husband? I'm just joking. I said, yes, because what is underneath that is rage. You're so enraged with your husband, you want to choke him out. I know because I'm a clinical therapist, you're not actually going to do it. But let's engage in an exercise here in my therapy room so that your rage can be witnessed. You want to choke him out? How? Are you going to choke him out in silence? Or are you going to say to him while you're choking him out? Right? Like accessing her rage. We don't allow ourselves an opportunity to be honest about our emotions, especially the ones that are undesirable. Hatred, fear, right? These are all feelings that we experience, but we bury them because they're too difficult they make us feel unseated. They make us feel dysregulated. But the reality of it is that we all have these impulses. We all have these feelings. We all have these urges, right? And these drives. And so when you're reading something, you can really go, oh, I hate that character. Good. Why do you hate that character? right? If you had to face that character in your own life, what would you have? What words would you have for that character? How would you deal with them? It's holding up a mirror to the way we do conflict. It's holding up a mirror to the way that we either retreat or engage with the world. It's holding up a mirror to us, our full self. We don't have to pretend. We don't have to cut off parts of ourselves. It's just me and the book and the emotional journey that I'm on with this, beginning, middle, and end. Um, and so I love that about engaging in fiction because there's an emotional journey that you go on with characters that teaches you a little something more about you and who you are and who you're becoming and how you authentically feel. There's nothing performative about reading, right? Unless you're in a book club and you feel like you can't say how you really feel. But for the most part, when we're reading, our emotions come up to the surface where they can be felt and witnessed, and it's cathartic.
Yeah.
It's a release. You ever read a book so good you just throw it across the room and then you're like, okay, let me get back to it. So it's really emotionally good for us to engage in all of our senses and all of our embodiment of all of our emotions, because that's what we need a lot of support doing. And so what I found as a therapist who uses literature with clients is that we get so much good work done, so much good healing done because we're integrating all of these experiences that clients have had that have been difficult to talk about, that have been difficult to name, that have been difficult to share through language. And it's really, really healing.
As I was listening to you, I realized that I'd need much more time than the allocated 45 minutes because you touched upon so many amazing topics. And I know a lot of those you can go a little deeper into if you read the book. Could you show the book again for our audience? And just as a little bit of, promotion, there's also actually a few interesting chapters, like a chapter on writing, which I wanted to touch upon, but I don't think we'll have time today. And a chapter on poetry, which really made me think of my kids and wondering, do they know any poems by heart? Because I think there is some beauty about resonating to a poem so much that you actually remember it. So there is so much to go into, and especially that aspect of the being the villain of the story, tapping into your darkness, and it's just amazing journey. So if you haven't read the book, go get the book, read it, and you'll also get a lot of reading inspiration because Emily does suggest so many other books in context. And one huge benefit of reading the book is there's a difference between reading and reading because we get transformation when our experience is coupled with a framework. So the book, reading a good novel, gives you the experience, but for you to learn from that experience, you sometimes need just a little nudge, what to think about, what to pay attention to, what kind of questions to ask. So that book, Bibliotherapy in the Bronx, it actually gives you the framework to read in a slightly more productive way. One more thing I wanted to mention is that, it was super humbling for me to see as the first examples of the books that you were talking about were children's books with very simple stories. We
Yes,
sometimes are so on the high horse with our non-fiction self-help industry that we forget that sometimes the biggest wisdom comes from the simple stories. Now,
absolutely.
but to just give you some ideas and maybe get excited about the book, because I don't have a lot of time to keep asking. I did want to ask one question, which I think is super important. If you get to if you're probably it requires a big answer, but still, how to pick a book, because you have read so many books and there is a huge science behind you picking the book for other people. But how do you pick a book for yourself? What is important?
I love that. So I'm a mood reader, and as I shared a little early on, for clients, I do a reading intake so that I can prescribe a book that's going to meet their preferences as a reader and also support me in the work we're doing in therapy. But for myself, I kind of have a similar intervention. So Dr. John Leedy, who is known as the father of poetry therapy here in America, he talks about this the way that music therapists talk about the ISO principle. You want to find a book that's going to meet the emotional tempo that you're looking for. So if you're feeling down, how do you want to feel? right? Do you want something to meet you in that space where you're having a hard day and you're feeling down? You might go for something that's a little bit more nostalgic or reflective. You might reach for a story that mirrors that grief or whatever that emotional tempo is that you're feeling. If you're feeling down and you need a picker upper, then you might reach for a story that is dealing with something that you're encountering in your life, but something that has a hopeful ending, something that can remind you that trouble doesn't last always, right? And so I always like to kind of, being a moody reader, I like to ask myself, what am I feeling? How do I want to feel? And then what's something that I can read or pick up that's going to elicit that kind of emotion? And sometimes I get it right. Sometimes I prescribe the wrong book, even to myself, but it's a practice, right? And so I always tell people, read the first 50 pages of a book. And if it doesn't resonate, you don't have to finish the book, right? But give yourself a chance to experiment with your moods and what you're looking for in a story at the time that you need a story that's medicine the most. That ISO principle is really key.
I really like the idea of moody reader. And as you can tell, I would be able, I mean, not be able, I would love to talk for a few days and go deep into all the topics. Unfortunately, we have to finish this session. I want to do the traditional. I'll ask my guest the last question, which I ask every guest. But for those of you who are watching us online, please leave a heart for my guest in the chat, and Marsha will bring up your hearts. And those of you who are watching it in recording, the majority of you still leave a heart. Actually, you can click the heart, but you can also leave a heart in the comment, because I think this love kind of transcends space and time. So it's very important. Now, a question to Emily. How would you like your book to change the world?
Oh, wow. I hope that my book reminds us that all of our stories matter. All of our stories matter, and we should own them and share them and find the humanity in them and be curious about your story, right? Like, healing is not linear. I always say healing is not linear, healing is narrative. So maybe there's things that you regret from the past. Maybe there's painful experiences that you've had, but you get to write a new chapter, right? Revision is always possible. So healing is narrative, and all of our stories matter.
Thank you so much for this very wonderful conversation. I truly enjoyed it. I do hope that we get to meet and talk about books more. I think there's not enough talk about books and reading.
I look forward to
For
scheduling your book club and getting more good recs from you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and those who are watching us live or in recording, thank you for joining us. For to our loyal followers, thank you for being loyal. As ever, if you happened here accidentally, follow Mind Valley Book Club, and actually also maybe Emily Rumble, because you also have your book club. Follow the book clubs. Talk to people who love reading. It's inspiring, and reading is good for your brain and for your mental health. So I hope to see you at my next interview, and thank you all once again. Bye bye.